Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Diamond, who is the George B. Mayer Assistant Professor of Urban and Environmental Studies in the Biology Department at Case Western Reserve University and an early career fellow of the Ecological Society of America. She's an evolutionary ecologist with specific interest in biological responses to climate and land use change. Please join me in welcoming her to talk about a crystal ball for climate change.
Thanks very much, Glenn, for the introduction. I am delighted to be here tonight to be able to tell you about some of the work that's been going on in my lab. So I tried to think of a better way to introduce the topic of climate change, and I couldn't think of one beyond Sir David Attenborough's remarks recently to the United Nations. And he says, right now, we are facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. And he goes on to say, if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. So I could stand up here and rattle off a million factoids about climate change to you all. But I think for the purposes of the talk today, it will serve our purposes to say that the burning of fossil fuels is leading to a warmer, more climatically variable world. And we've seen that, right? Over the past several years, these have been some of the warmest years on record. Climatically variable describes the sort of increased frequency and severity of these extreme weather events. If you'll all remember earlier this year, back to the polar vortex that we all suffered through, we're expecting a lot of those sort of extreme events to continue and become more severe in the future. And so I just want to ground that a little bit for us using plant hardiness zones. And we can actually use plant hardiness zones and their shifts as a signal of climate change. And so what you're looking at in this map is plant hardiness zone map for the continental United States. And so these are data from 1990. And we go from cooler zones in these sort of darker blue shades to warmer zones in these sort of more yellow shades, right? And they basically give us an indicator of where to grow certain plants based on climate. And so we grow cold-adapted plants in the north, and we grow warm-adapted plants in the south, right? And so when you go to the store and you buy your seed packet, you flip it over, and you look to see if those plants can actually grow in your particular climatic zone. And in 1990, northern Ohio was mostly zone 5, right? So just to put that in perspective for you all, 1990, that was when I was in elementary school. So just to give you a temporal timestamp right there. Okay, so that's 1990. The transition to the next slide is going to show you how the plant hardiness zone map has changed over the last 20 years. So keep your eye on northern Ohio. Whoosh, okay? So now, most of northern Ohio is in hardiness zone 6, right? We've shifted an entire plant hardiness zone over a mere 20 years. And just to put that in context again for you guys, so 2012 was a couple years after I earned my PhD. And so in the time between elementary school and PhD, we've shifted an entire climatic plant hardiness zone in northern Ohio. And what this works out to is a shift of 13 miles per decade in these climatic zones. And we're expecting these trends to continue forward in time as well. So that's what's happening to the climate, but as a biologist, I'm interested in how climate is impacting biological communities. So what are these changes in our environment doing to the plants and animals and microorganisms that live there? And ideally, we would like to see what's going to happen in the future. And this is where the crystal ball metaphor comes into play. We want to peer into our crystal ball and sort of know what future communities are going to look like as they're responding to and dealing with climate change. And that basically gives us a map of which species, and importantly, the services that they provide to ecosystems and humans as well, are potentially most vulnerable to climate change. So we want to look into our crystal ball and figure out which species are going to be most imperiled in the future as they sort of weather the storm of climate change. And on the one hand, this is important because it raises awareness at a global scale of species that we might lose. But it also allows us to identify the species that are going to be in trouble in the future and try to help them out. Give them a little boost so that they're not going to go extinct under climate change. And that's sort of what we want, right? We want to peer into the crystal ball and know what's going to happen in the future. So keep that in your head for the moment. I want to talk now about the changes that we've already seen with climate change happening over the past several decades. And so thinking back on this time scale over which these plant hardiness zones were shifting in the previous example. So going from 1990 to 2012, this shift from hardiness zone 5 to hardiness zone 6. What's sort of happening in that time frame? And so I want you don't have to close your eyes, but just think about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, driving your car down the road. It's covered in insects, right? I mean, how many people remember tons and tons and tons of insects from, yes, right, exactly. And now, not so much, right? I distinctly remember driving to university every single summer and driving along Route 15 in Pennsylvania, going back to Bucknell University where I did my undergraduate degree, and my car would just be a wall of insects. Of course, that road went right by the river. And I was fortunate enough to be invited back there to give a talk to the Department of Biology. It was really fantastic. But I bet my partner, I was like, this car is going to be a mess. It's going to be covered in insects by the time I come back. And I came back, and the car was spotless. There were very, very few insects on that windshield. And this lack of insects has, been given a term. It's called the windshield phenomena, and it's been seen sort of the world over. And it's not just you, it's everyone. And it's led a lot of people to become very concerned about the insects. And there's an article in the New York Times where they basically proclaimed that the insect apocalypse is here. And other claims associated with this article and many others were saying that insects were going to be gone in 50 years or 100 years' time. And so I just want to break that down a little bit. Where are these, claims coming from? Well, savvy people have been monitoring insects over the last several decades using lots of different techniques. So we have a sort of net here, so people go around and sort of net the insects. There's this black light approach, so people basically set up lights at nighttime and the insects come. And people count up all of the insects of the particular species that they see, and if they do this repeatedly over time, then they can track how those insects are doing over time, and that's what's going on in this graph here. So it's basically a global index of insect abundances right at that 1 line, that horizontal line at 1, that's where we would be if the insects were maintaining their abundances over time. And what you see are essentially 2 lines here. So the top one in orange is the trend between 1970 and 2010 for lepidopterans, so butterflies and moths. And you can see that it's declining. And then all other invertebrates are sort of lumped into this red line below them, and they're even worse off, right? So they're declining very, very precipitously over this time interval in which climate change is happening. And sort of that's the basis for where these claims about the insect apocalypse are coming from. And the thing that we're really worried about is, okay, so the declines are scary, but we don't want those lines to crash to 0, right? Because that's when the insects are extinct, right? We don't want those abundances to just, go to nothing. Okay, so we want to avoid insect extinction, but I just want to put extinction in context for you. So, most species, and by most I mean really most, so 99.9% of the species that ever lived on planet Earth are now extinct. They're not around anymore. And you might sort of conjure up images of the dinosaurs up here, but many, many, many other species have gone extinct as well. The trouble is that extinction rate, this sort of greater than 99% species loss, has happened over millions of years. And so in this graph right here is basically a spiral depiction starting at the bottom and going at the sort of top right here. Is the history of life on Earth, right? And so millions and millions and millions of years. And that's the context in which we've seen that sort of biodiversity loss of 99%. The trouble is that our current rates of extinction are incredibly high, and they're compressed over a very, very, very short time window. And so there was a recent report that just came out, a global biodiversity survey of how life on Earth is dealing with climate change, and they estimate that 1 in 4 species faces extinction with a temperature increase of 4 degrees Celsius. And that's what we're anticipating with global climate change by the end of the century. And that's all compressed into that tiny little orange bar right at the end of the Holocene, our modern era. All of that extinction is just pressed into this tiny little window. So yes, there's lots of extinction over the history of the Earth. The trouble is we're just getting rapid, accelerating rates of extinction compressed into a very tiny little time frame. And it's especially sort of alarming for the insects. And the insects make up over half of described species, which you can see in this pie chart right here. So the insects are depicted in the red shapes, and everything else, so that's chordates, including us, fungi, lichens, plants, diatoms, bacteria, viruses, other invertebrates make up the other half. So the insects are incredibly speciose and important for many services that are important for humans. And so insects do pollination for us. They provide food for other organisms. There are important sources of pest control. So if you think about beneficial insects in your garden, they do that for us as well. They're also very important for decomposition. And so the sort of push and pull here is that we have thousands of insect species that are monitored across limited locations. So we have sort of a handful of puzzle pieces, and we're trying to see the entire puzzle that's made up of, 1 million plus described insect species globally. And the big question is whether or not we're getting sort of robust picture of how insects are responding to global change with just those little tiny puzzle pieces. And so we do this by relying on observations. The trouble is that we have very, very few observational data sets. And so we have to be lucky enough to have people that have monitored insects either before and during climate change to have these observational data. Okay, so that's sort of what's going on with recent climate change and insect responses. We want to look forward, right? We want to peer into our crystal ball and figure out what the insects are doing in the future. And so one way that we can do that is through experiments. And so I was fortunate to be part of a very large experimental warming experiment where so this was the experiment being set up. So we basically got a backhoe, dug a trench, put a bunch of pipes down, and the final result was something like this, where we artificially warmed the forest floor and then looked at how insects responded to that experimental warming. And so the warming basically mimicked future climate change for us in these little tiny arenas. And what we found, interestingly, and so these are our data from ant communities, is a mix of species that were increasing under experimental climate change and species that were declining under climate change. So below this line, species are declining. Above this line, species are increasing. And we see a range of different responses. So some are sort of benefiting with climate change, some are declining. But there's some limitations on this approach, right? And so we ran this experiment for 5 years, and that's not, what we're expecting with climate change. Climate change is this sort of ongoing process that keeps happening on and on and on. And we ended the experiment after 5 years. So we're sort of only capturing these short-term responses, and that actually might be part of the reason that we're seeing some species that are actually increasing under climate change. It's also really expensive. So renting a backhoe and laying out this pipe and experimentally warming the forest floor is very, very expensive. And so it's not tractable for us to be able to do experiments of that scale all the time. So we're sort of stuck a little bit, right? We want to know what the future holds, but we're limited by the experiments that we can pull off. And so if we just step back for a second and say, all right, pie in the sky, if we make a wish list of exactly what we would want to know what the future is going to be like, well, we want something, we want climate change that mimics future projections, so gives us a sense of what the climate's going to be like in the future. We want to cover lots of species, and we want to cover lots of locations. And we want it to be free, right? We don't want to pay for it. It was an awful lot of work and an awful lot of money to pull off those climate manipulations. And so ideally, it would be free for us. And so I want you to keep that wish list in your head.
Apparently, the insects don't walk towards colder climates or colder eras.
Insects are on the move in a big, big way. So they are shifting in space. They have undergone dramatic shifts in their geographic range poleward, mostly, although some insects are experiencing range contraction, so more equatorward, particularly those that aren't able to deal with climate change. But by and large, insects are on the move, and they're going poleward to track those sort of cooler or historical climates that they might have experienced. The trouble is, for insects, especially something like an ant that can't fly that well, they can only disperse at a relatively slow rate compared to something like a butterfly or a dragonfly that can just, get out of the way of climate change to some degree. So we are definitely seeing some mitigation on the part of the insects themselves to deal with climate change in that way.
A lot of those graphs looked like they were very quantitative, but the ordinates were very unfamiliar. It just had something like abundance. Could you describe what the vertical axis of those graphs were?
Yeah, so the vertical axis were basically, if you take all of the sort of individual counts for a particular species and then take the average over time. So in that particular graph from 1970 to 2010, so you're looking at average insect abundance for all the species that they monitored over time. And so you could pull out sort of individual lines for species and track those abundances for individual species over time, but they tend to show declines in abundance at the per species level as well.
We see insects all over the world. They adapt. So in addition to migration, is there any evolutionary changes that has been observed?
Yes, you're foreshadowing the end of my talk. Thank you. That's perfect. Yeah, so in terms of evolutionary change, we do see insects that are capable of evolving in response to climate change. And I'll sort of get into that in the third section of the talk. There's some caveats associated with that, and many of them have to do, again, with this issue of the sort of rapidity and scale of climate change. So yes, insects have evolved over millions of years to climate, but again, the climate is changing very, very rapidly and putting very, very strong pressure on them to be able to mount an evolutionary response. So some are doing that, some are not doing that. I'll definitely tell you a little bit about ones that are able to do that later on.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Professor Sarah Diamond discussing climate change and its noticeable impact on the plant and insect populations. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Professor Diamond will discuss how urban heat islands can be used as crystal balls for climate change. Now, back to the talk.
So I left you with this notion of the wish list, right? So if we wanted sort of our pie in the sky vision of what we will want to be able to forecast what future communities are going to look like under climate change. And the super cool thing is that we have it, and we have it everywhere. And we haven't realized it for a while, and now people are sort of waking up to this idea. And it's the idea that future global climates are basically present day in cities. And so this is just a thermal image of the city of Chicago. And you can see the water in these sort of bluer purple tones is a bit cooler compared to the city proper and the buildings that are warmer in these sort of more orangey yellow tones. For many cities, many even just small to mid-sized cities, the temperature difference between non-urban or undeveloped habitats, such as the forest plot that I'm showing you here, and developed areas, is on the order of 4 degrees Celsius. And so I'm just showing you some shots around Cleveland. So that's the university farm right there. And then that's just outside the art museum as well. And so the temperature difference between those two habitats is on the order of 4 degrees Celsius. The convenient thing is that temperature difference between non-urban and urban environments is exactly what we're expecting with climate change by 2100. So by the end of the century, we're expecting 4 degrees Celsius on average worth of climate change at a global scale. The other very convenient thing about cities is that they're everywhere. So this is just a night sky image, composite image, of course, of the extent of urbanization across the globe, right? And so we have cities all over the place. We have them in warm climates, we have them in cool climates, we have these little mini greenhouses all over the world. And it's free, right? So we built cities for humans to live in, for us to live in. We didn't intend them as climate manipulations or climate experiments, but that's exactly what they are. And so we can use cities as sort of unintended experiments to get a sense of what those future communities are going to look like, right? And so cities are basically allowing us a crystal ball to peer into a future warmer world that we're expecting at the global scale. And there's lots of life in cities, right? And this is sort of, a fun artist rendition of that. But there's lots of plants and animals and microorganisms that live in cities. They're not these barren wastelands. There's lots of life for us to study and understand how it's able to cope with these elevated temperatures in cities. And maybe this isn't such a cartoony example. Here's a picture of a fox hanging out in some urbanized areas as well. Okay. So, there's life in cities. How does it do that, right? How is it able to cope with these altered environments, in particular these warmed environments? And so strategy number one that I'll talk about, there's 3 strategies, is to come pre-prepared, right? And this is a process that we call exaptation. You will notice above me that there's a picture of a rock dove sitting on a rocky outcropping. You might know it better in the city as a pigeon, and they have all these wonderful morphological adaptations for dealing with perching on these rocky outcroppings, and they feel right at home in the city. So they're pre-prepared to live in cities to cope with city life. Strategy number 2 is just to be flexible, go with the flow in the urban environment. And this is a process that we call phenotypic plasticity. And so I'd like to tell you about this cool example of urban phenotypic plasticity in these crows. So this is a picture of an American crow up here, but in Japan, in Sendai in particular, these crows basically put walnuts in the middle of the city street, and they wait for the cars to come along and crush the walnuts. They actually look at the traffic signals, they wait for the all clear, they go into the road, and they pull out the walnut reward. And so obviously they don't do this in non-urban areas, but they do it in the city, so they're flexible in dealing with city life. So they're incredible. Corvids are amazing animals. Okay, and the third strategy, which was alluded to earlier, is to adapt or evolve in response to the challenges in cities. And so now I'd like to tell you about this really fun example of evolution in the city with this hawksbeard plant pictured behind me. And so what you need to know about this plant is that it basically produces 2 types of seeds. So behind me, there is a seed that does not have a little plume coming off of it, and those seeds don't disperse very far. They drop right next to the parent plant. Contrast that with the one with the plume on it. Those seeds basically go up into the air column, they catch the wind, and they disperse very, very far away from the parent plant. And rural plants tend to make a lot of those seeds, right? It's not good if you're growing up right underneath your parent plant because you have to compete for nutrients and light and all of those sorts of things. Interestingly, urban plants make a ton of the seeds without the plume, so the seeds that just drop right next to the parent plant. And what's going on here is that it's really bad to send your seeds far away in the city because you're going to send them into the middle of the road, you're going to send them into the sidewalk. Usually the only place that's good for you in the city is right next to you because you're basically, if you're a hawksbeard plant, growing up in sort of like a crack in the pavement or maybe a median or something like that. So it's much better to drop your seeds next to you than have the ones that kind of shoot far away. And so what researchers have done is basically take the urban plants and take the rural plants, and they bring them back into the same environment. So they grow them up under comparable environmental conditions, and they find those differences between the urban plants producing the seeds that just drop versus the rural plants producing the seeds that get flung far away. Those differences persist when they're reared under common conditions in the laboratory. And that gives us evidence that there's been evolution happening, that there's been a genetic change in these urban versus rural populations and these hawksbeard plants. And this is remarkably fast evolution. So we think about evolution as being a relatively slow process happening over millions of years. The evolution of these seed types in these hawksbeard plants have happened over mere decades, right? And this has sort of upturned how we were thinking about evolution, because we think, by and large, very, very slow process. And yet here we have examples of very, very rapid evolution in response to urbanization. And so now I'd just like to break down sort of relatively how common these different strategies might be. And this first strategy, being pre-prepared, it might work for some species, but it's probably not going to work for the vast majority of species that are living in the city. For strategies 2 and 3, this plasticity or flexibility and evolution or adaptation to city life, well, we just don't have a good sense yet of how common those different strategies are. And it's really interesting for the case of urban evolution. And so urban evolution had sort of famous or auspicious beginnings with Bernard Kettlewell's work on the peppered moths, right? And so this was the classic case of these melanistic moths, which you can hopefully see up there, although it's pretty camouflage, being favored over the lighter moths with industrial pollution. So melanistic moths were basically being camouflaged by predators, and this was another example of evolution in response to urbanization. But after those sort of famous origins, the general area of study, and by that I mean urban evolution, it just kind of sat for decades, and people didn't really do anything with it. And part of the reason, interestingly, is that there was this sort of prevailing view that cities were, not worthy of biologist study, right? That biologists should be out in pristine nature and, studying sort of, beautiful wildflowers in the mountains. That we shouldn't be bothering ourselves with what's going on in the city that's unnatural and inherently not interesting. And I have to confess myself that I kind of fell into that trap as well. I was sort of not a fan of urban evolution. I was like, yeah, maybe it's just, something that's maybe like faddish or, along those lines, and not something that was worthy of our study. And I will tell you in a bit how I have completely changed my mind, thanks to Cleveland, actually. So coming to Cleveland has completely changed my mind about urban evolution and the value that it can give us.
In one of our earlier origin sessions, it talked about life evolving or emerging on Earth when Earth was 2 degrees centigrade warmer. Does that imply that other species might emerge with the warming climate?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question about sort of the emergence of new species in response to climate. So interestingly, in context of cities, because we have this very dramatic temperature differential between the urbanized areas and the non-urban areas, we've been looking at the potential for that difference to generate new species, so driving reproductive isolation between these two different populations and potentially leading to new species. The problem is that speciation events like that probably aren't going to keep pace with the broad and rapid extinction rates that we're experiencing right now. So there might be some sort of small mitigating factors going on there, but by and large, the unfortunately rapid extinction rates are probably going to swamp that.
So you said there was a 4-degree temperature difference between the cities and the undeveloped areas, but is that constant throughout the year? And does what we expect for global warming, is that also going to vary with the seasons?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The 4 degrees Celsius is a convenience for sure. Cities are incredibly, incredibly variable environments. The surface temperature difference between urbanized areas, like if we just walked outside here on a sunny day versus the, university farm, could be in excess of 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. And even within the city, right, if you're sort of situated in the shaded side of a building, that can be several degrees Celsius different from, the warm side of a building. And I have a colleague who works on scale insects on city trees, and she has found on the order of like 2 to 3 degrees Celsius difference between trees on one side of the street and trees on the other side of the street. So there is a lot of heterogeneity that is underlying those averages for sure. And they vary seasonally as well. They vary diurnally. So there's this phenomenon known as nighttime biased warming in cities. So those minimum temperatures are way higher at night in the city compared to the daytime, which only sees a sort of small difference between urban and non-urban areas. So lots and lots and lots of variation, yeah.
Didn't this global warming happen after the Ice Age? Because after the Ice Age, everything got warm. Isn't that the same phenomenon that's happening right now?
So there has been dramatic changes to the climate in the Earth's history. No one is disputing that at all. The trouble is that the rate of change is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. So again, it's this idea of compressing large amounts of warming into a very, very narrow time window that species are having a really, really hard time dealing with. Well, I mean, and the fact that humans are directly responsible for it too, yes.
Well, have they figured out what it is that keeps them from reproducing? Is it the air quality? Is it the lack of reproduction? Is it what is it?
Yeah, so in some cases, the temperature effects are making them have offset reproductive cycles. So there's a really, really strong relationship between temperature and reproduction cycles in a lot of organisms. And so what we're seeing in the few examples that we have is that the urban populations are essentially emerging earlier and producing offspring earlier, mating earlier, producing offspring earlier compared to those non-urban environments. And so the sort of timing of mating is actually offset between the warm urban environment and the cool non-urban environment.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Professor Sarah Diamond. Professor Diamond holds the George B. Meyer Chair in Urban and Environmental Studies at Case Western Reserve University's Department of Biology. In the second part of our talk, we learned how plants and animals, which evolved in natural environments, cope with cities. In our final segment, Professor Diamond will talk about how she has used acorn ants in Northeast Ohio to study adaptation in response to climate change. Now, back to our talk.
So I talked briefly about how people have ignored this field of urban evolution for some time. And then overnight, this field sprung up and grew dramatically. And so this is a summary figure from a recent synthesis of every single study that we have on urban evolution. And they found 192 studies to review. And this is just a small sampling of the different species and geographic locations where we have definitive evidence of evolution in response to urbanization, including urban heat island effects. And our humble little acorn ant is situated right at the top. And now I'll tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing with these ants that live entirely within acorns. And so as we're going through this, I just want you to think about one thing, and that's that I'm telling you a story about acorn ants, but it's really about us. and our ability to withstand changes in our climate. And so these acorn ants provide very important ecosystem services. So they're really critical scavengers and detritivores in our environment. So they perform very important ecosystem services for us, but they're also important indicators of other insects' responses to global change. So potentially, if they can make it, other species can as well. And just to zoom in on our acorn ants, so this is a zoom in. They're about 1 millimeter, so if you just take the sort of top of your pinky nail, they're about the width of that. So they're very, very, very tiny little creatures that live entirely within the acorn environment. And you can see the worker up here is sort of moving around this white blob. So that is an immature ant, and that'll one day grow up to be one of the worker ants that's carrying it around. And there have been some really dramatic changes to the habitat that these acorn ants live in. And so just showing you a picture of typical rural habitat. So they love living in forests, obviously near oak trees. They also live in hickory nuts, so those are good habitats for them. But cities have kind of sprung up around them, including in Cleveland, Ohio. And we actually have data for acorn ants records going back to 1890 in Cleveland, and we've been able to monitor them across that entire period. And so what it looks like happened is that the acorn ants were here, and the city just sprung up around them. And so their environment has been modified, have been warmed over the last century. And what we have with these urbanized sites that our acorn ants live in are basically little forest pockets that are surrounded by urban matrix, or concrete and buildings and roads and sidewalks and all of that stuff, which is retaining heat. And that spillover of that retained heat into these forest pockets is warming the environment that the acorn ants live in. So even though they're living in these little isolated forest pockets, it's still much warmer in those environments. And so what we were able to do is stick tiny little temperature probes inside of acorns and then look at how the temperature shifted between rural and urban habitats. And there's a very dramatic shift in the temperature between these two environments. So in blue, you're looking at the temperature distribution. So it's basically just a frequency distribution, so how often those different temperatures show up in those different habitats. Much cooler in the rural environment than the urban environment. If you just look at the peak of those distributions, the most common temperatures, that's over a 5 degrees Celsius difference in this particular trace between those urban and rural habitats. And that's how the acorn ants are actually experiencing that environment. Another thing that you should know about acorn ants is that they not only live inside that nut environment. So the queen lives in there, the immature ants live in there, young workers that have just hatched out from the immature stages and have turned into workers live in there. And then when workers get old enough, they basically venture outside the nest and they go and forage for food. And so their landscapes are even more variable. And so what you're looking at right now are two thermal images that were centered on known acorn ant nests. So the pictures are basically perfectly centered on a known acorn ant nest site. And then around that is basically the foraging landscape that those ants need to contend with. And so you can see in the rural habitat, it's much more uniform and it's cooler in these sort of purple shades compared to the urban habitat, which is a lot more patchy and a lot warmer, right, with these sort of more yellow to orange shades. And so what's happening in the city is that we sort of have reduced canopy cover as well, and it's making these sort of extremely hot light gaps that the ants that are foraging have to navigate and run through in order to be able to gather food. So it's not only warmer in the nest environment, it's also very warm outside the nest environment as foragers are seeking food. All right, so first things first, when you're starting an experiment, you have to document variation to work with. And so we picked a trait that we thought would be important for how the ants were able to respond to cities. And we picked heat tolerance because we thought, right, that's going to be important for dealing with temperature rise. And so what you're looking at in the graph behind me on the y-axis is basically a measure of their heat tolerance. And then on the bottom, we have the heat tolerance responses for the rural environment and the urban environment. These were ants just pulled out of the wild and then tested for their heat tolerance. And we see a dramatic shift between the rural and the urban population. So the urban ants are a degree Celsius more heat tolerant than those rural populations. And for somebody who's a thermal physiologist, this was shocking to me that you would see that dramatic of a shift across those two different environments. But the trouble is, since we just pulled those ants out of the wild, we don't know if that increase in heat tolerance was driven by the fact that cities are just hotter, or if there has been an evolutionary change that would allow those urban ants to have that higher heat tolerance. So we want to be able to disentangle the plastic response from the evolved response underlying that increased heat tolerance. And the way that we do that is through a lot of undergraduate student labor of love, though, I think. So here we have a student of ours, Jade, who, does anybody recognize this particular location? Right, so this is right outside the art museum where you can often see us collecting acorn ants. It's a really good site. And so what we do is basically go around and find acorns and crack them open and hope to get acorn ant colony inside them. And so once we get enough of those, the urban ants and the rural ants, we bring them back into our laboratory and rear them in these growth chamber environments where we can basically make it any climate that we want within that growth chamber. And so what we did was take rural ants and we put them into a growth chamber that mimicked what they would typically see in the rural environment, so a rural climate, and then put them in a chamber that mimicked a new environment, so basically the urban climate. And then we did the same thing for the urban ants. So we pull them out of the field and then we put them in growth chambers that mimic their home environment, so the urban climate, and then a new environment, the rural climate. And so what we did, we have the queen, so that's the big, darker ant right there. She lays new eggs. The old workers die. And so this is actually pretty important. So the workers only live 30 days. So they have a very, very short lifespan. And that allows these new eggs to grow up into new workers, and they've only ever experienced the lab environment, these climates that we've given them. So there's no sort of lingering effects from the environment that would potentially influence our results. And so once we rear them up for a long time in the lab, we basically put them into tiny little tubes about this big. And then we put them in a dry block incubator, and then we increase the temperature by 1 degree Celsius every single minute until they do this thing where it's like the onset of muscle spasms. And that's basically an ecological death, because those ants, if they were out in the wild, wouldn't be able to crawl away to a thermal refuge. So they would essentially be dead in nature, even though they aren't quite dead in the lab. All right. So I just want to go through a few expectations, which will get us ready for our results. One possibility is that we could entirely see this mechanism of plasticity or flexibility that we saw before with the crow example for the heat tolerance response to temperature across these urban and rural populations, right? So you'll have a higher heat tolerance if you're reared in a warmer climate, that urban mimicking climate, but we won't see any difference between the urban and the rural populations' responses. The other possibility is that we could see evolution and just an evolutionary response, right? So the ants aren't responding to the rearing temperature. Their heat tolerance doesn't matter if it's in a cool growth chamber or a warm growth chamber. Those urban ants always have higher heat tolerance compared to those rural ants. Or we could have both, because nature is tricky, right? So we could have both phenotypic plasticity and both evolution underlying those increases in heat tolerance that we saw before. And so those are our three options. So go ahead in your mind, place your bets on what you think is going to happen. Ready? Okay. All right, so that's what we see. We see evidence for both. It's both plasticity and both evolution. So along the y-axis to orient you, we have the heat tolerance values. On the x-axis, we have the different temperature treatments, so the rural mimicking cool climate and the urban mimicking warm climate. And then we have the two population responses. So the urban ants are in the orange and the rural ants are in the blue. And we see evidence of plasticity, right? So if you're reared in a warm climate, you have higher heat tolerance. We also amazingly see evidence of evolution. So the urban ants, regardless of the environment that you rear them in, a hot one or a cool one, they always have higher heat tolerance compared to the rural ants, which suggests to us there's been a genetic change or evolution in the heat tolerance of these acorn ants. And it's incredible, right? Because we're seeing evolution right under our feet, literally right under our feet in these acorns, and in our lifetimes. And this is remarkably fast evolution. It's another case, just like we saw with the hawksbeard plant, of very, very rapid evolution. And so we call this rapid or contemporary evolution. And this sort of adds to our growing evidence of this process happening in nature, that we don't need millions of years for evolution to occur. And so, the worry, right, with any scientist is, well, maybe it was a fluke. Maybe Cleveland is just really special. Maybe, who knows? So, of course, we had to go out and test other cities, and we've tested multiple cities now. And in most of them, we do see evidence that acorn ant heat tolerance is evolving in these urban environments, except for Cincinnati. Cincinnati never cooperates. I don't know what's going on there. So we've also seen the evolution of lots of other traits as well. So I've sort of focused on heat tolerance, but we have very strong evidence for the evolution of cold tolerance, metabolic rate, running speed, which is a fantastic project to do. I'll tell you about it. But interestingly, not all traits evolve in acorn ants. So we have no evidence of the evolution of body size in acorn ant responses to cities. And we're accumulating evidence of rapid evolution in response to urban heat islands from other taxonomic groups as well. So the evolution of body size in these Anolis cristatellus lizards in cities. Again, the evolution of heat tolerance in these Daphnia, or these water fleas. And I just snuck this in here because I wanted to tell you we had an undergraduate student who started this project. She's really interested in roly-polies. And she wondered if they were also adapting to urban heat. And so she started this project, a graduate student added more data to it, and basically again found evidence that roly-polies, of course, were also evolving higher heat tolerance in response to these urban heat island effects. And so the real question is whether rapid evolution is enough, right? Is it enough to overcome this potential decline toward zero and potential extinction? And I would say yes, with some caveats. So yes, certainly rapid evolution can provide a means to avoid extinction. But it's important for us to recognize that as cities continue to warm, cities will continue to warm as the global climate continues to warm, right? We're not pressing pause on climate change. Cities aren't protected from that. They're going to warm relative to the background climate, on and on and on. And we just don't know how many species are going to evolve. So we have maybe over a dozen species now that we've shown adaptation to urban heat islands, but did we get lucky again? How sort of broadly is this evolutionary response construed? And the other caveat is that the process depletes genetic variation, so species are potentially running out of steam as they evolve in response to cities, right? You only have so much genetic variation to work with, and if you use it up adapting to cities, then you don't have any more to deal with sort of ongoing urban heat island effects or ongoing climate change. And so I would say that urban evolution is more a Band-Aid than a cure-all. And it's probably going to buy us some time for species to be able to cope with climate change, but we have to act now on the sources of climate change in order to prevent future catastrophes. I would argue that cities are a new scientific frontier, and one that I'm incredibly excited about, and that we can use them as a crystal ball for peering into a future warmed world that's happening at an unprecedented scale. Thanks very much.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.